The sky over the Solomon Islands was on fire. At 14,000 feet, Lieutenant Marcus Dutch Holloway was flying through hell. His B-24 Liberator, nicknamed the Iron Wolf, was caught in a maelstrom of tracers and cannon shells. 3 Japanese Zeros were on his tail, their 20mm cannons tearing chunks out of starboard wing. 2 more were diving from above, their machine guns chattering like angry typewriters. Dutch hauled the yoke hard left, throwing the heavy bomber into a banking turn that made the airframe scream in protest. The co-pilot, a baby-faced kid from Texas named Reeves, was calling out enemy positions so fast his words ran together. 6 o'clock high, 3 o'clock level, 9 o'clock climbing. Jesus Christ, they're everywhere. The top turret gunner was hammering away at a Zero that kept making passes on the right. The waist gunners were leaning out their windows, firing blindly into the chaos. Brass casings were raining down inside the fuselage like metal hail. The smell of cordite and sweat filled the cabin. But Dutch knew the truth that every B-24 pilot in the Pacific knew. They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet, because underneath them, where no one could see, where no gun could reach, the killing blow was being prepared. 2 Zeros had dropped below the bomber's belly, sliding into blind spot like sharks moving beneath a swimmer. They were invisible to every gun on the plane. The belly of the B-24 was just smooth aluminum, no turret, no weapons, no hope. It was a design flaw the size of a billboard, and every Japanese pilot in the theater knew how to exploit it. Dutch watched his altimeter. 13,800 feet. 13,600. They were losing altitude fast, bleeding speed from the damage and the evasive maneuvers. The number 2 engine was running hot, the temperature gauge pushing into the red zone. He knew what was coming next. The Zeros below would pull up into a vertical climb, hang on their propellers like hummingbirds, and pour cannon fire straight into the fuel tanks. The Iron Wolf would become a fireball, and 6 American boys would fall into the Pacific in pieces. Unless the trap worked. Dutch pressed the intercom button. His voice was calm, almost casual, like he was ordering coffee. "Sully," he said, "now would be a good time." In the belly of the bomber, Sergeant Patrick Sullivan, Sully to everyone who knew him, was crouched next to a hole in the floor that wasn't supposed to exist. The hole was roughly 3 feet square, cut where the ventral gun position should have been. The Army Air Force had removed the ventral guns from early B-24s to save weight, leaving the belly completely defenseless. It was a cost-saving measure that had cost hundreds of lives. Sully had fixed that problem 3 weeks ago with a hacksaw, a blowtorch, and a flagrant disregard for military regulations. He grabbed the weapon beside him, a .50 caliber M2 Browning machine gun, mounted on a swiveling bracket that he'd welded together from scrap parts in the dead of night. The gun was secured to the floor with reinforced steel plates, but the mount allowed it to pivot freely. Below the mount, the floor had been cut away, creating a firing port straight down. It was crude. It was unauthorized. It was brilliant. Sully released a safety clamp and swung the gun into position, pointing straight down through the opening. The wind screamed up through the hole, a freezing blast that made his eyes water. He locked his boots into the stirrups he'd bolted to the floor, another modification that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had noticed. He looked down, and there they were, 2 Zeros, close enough to count the rivets on their wings. They were climbing in perfect formation, their noses pointed up at the belly of the Iron Wolf. Sully could see the pilots' faces behind their goggles. They looked confident. They looked like hunters who'd cornered their prey. They had no idea they were the ones being hunted. Sully didn't hesitate. He pressed his shoulder against the stock and squeezed the trigger. The gun erupted with a sound like the world splitting in half. The recoil was vicious, trying to tear the weapon out of his hands, but the mount held. The muzzle flash lit up the inside of the fuselage like a lightning strike. Hot brass ejected from the chamber and bounced around the cramped space. And below, the stream of .50 caliber bullets poured straight down into the climbing Zeros. The physics were obscene. The Japanese fighters were moving upward at nearly 200 miles per hour. The bullets were falling downward at over 2,800 feet per second. When they met, the result wasn't combat, it was demolition. The lead Zero flew, directly into the stream. The rounds punched through the thin aluminum skin of the engine, cowling like it was tissue paper. The radial engine disintegrated. Chunks of cylinder heads and piston rods exploded outward in a spray of metal fragments. The propeller wobbled, then sheared off entirely, tumbling away into the blue. The pilot tried to pull out a climb, but his plane was already dying. Black smoke poured from the shattered engine. The Zero rolled over onto its back, stalled, and began spiraling down toward the ocean, trailing a corkscrew of smoke. The second Zero pilot saw his wingman explode and panicked. He broke left hard, tried to escape the dead zone, but Sully was already tracking him. He walked the tracers across the fighter's fuselage like a kid with a garden hose. The bullets tore into the cockpit. The canopy shattered into 1,000 glittering fragments. The Zero lurched violently, then snap-rolled into a dive it would never pull out of. 2 kills. 8 seconds. Up in the cockpit, Dutch felt the vibrations of the gun firing through the floor. He couldn't see what was happening below, but he saw the results. 2 plumes of black smoke appeared beneath the bomber, falling away toward the water. He keyed the intercom. Sully status? 2 down, skipper, came a reply, calm as Sunday morning. And I think the rest of them just figured out we're not defenseless anymore. He was right. The remaining Zeros had seen their comrades disintegrate. They scattered like startled birds, breaking off their attack runs and pulling back to a safe distance. They circled warily, trying to understand what had just happened. But Dutch knew they'd be back. Japanese pilots didn't give up easily. Stay sharp back there, he said. This isn't over. The fight for the Iron Wolf had only just begun, but for the first time in the Pacific Theater, a lone B-24 had teeth that could bite back from below. 3 weeks earlier, the argument had nearly ended Sullivan's career. It happened on the tarmac at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, under the merciless tropical sun. Sully stood in front of his bomber with a cutting torch in one hand and a diagram in the other, explaining his plan to modify the aircraft's belly. Captain Gerald Briggs, the Squadron operations officer, stood 10 feet away, looking like he'd just swallowed a live grenade. Absolutely not, Briggs said, his voice tight with fury. You want to cut a hole in the floor of a pressurized aircraft? You want to mount an unsecured weapon on a bracket you welded yourself? Are you out of your goddamn mind, Sergeant? Sully kept his voice level. Sir, the B-24 has a blind spot underneath the size of Rhode Island. The Zeros know it. They attack from below because they know we can't shoot back. We've lost 8 planes this month alone to that exact tactic. And you think the solution is to butcher a multi-million-dollar bomber with a hacksaw? I think the solution is to put a gun where the enemy doesn't expect one. Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice to a dangerous whisper. Do you know what happens when you compromise the structural integrity of an airframe at altitude? The fuselage could crack. The whole back half of the plane could tear off. You'd kill your entire crew before the Japanese even got a shot at you. Sully met his eyes. With respect, sir, they're already getting their shots. They're just taking them from a position where we can't return fire. I'd rather die trying something than die, for sure, doing nothing. This conversation is over. You will not modify this aircraft. That's an order. Sully stood at attention. Yes, sir. But that night, after the officers had gone to bed, Sully and his crew chief, a lanky mechanic from Louisiana named Corporal Pike, went back to the bomber with their tools. They worked by flashlight, using a cutting torch to remove a section of the floor plating. They reinforced the edges with steel brackets scavenged from a wrecked P-40. They built a mount for the .50 cal using parts from 3 different gun turrets. They welded, bolted, and riveted in silence, stopping every time they heard footsteps. By dawn, the modification was complete. They covered the hole with a false floor panel that could be removed in seconds. From the outside, the plane looked normal. Dutch Holloway, then just a co-pilot, had watched the whole thing from the shadows. He didn't report them. He didn't help them. He just watched. The next morning, Captain Briggs inspected the Iron Wolf before mission. He walked around the fuselage, checking the tires and fuel lines. He never looked under the belly. The secret held. For 3 weeks, Sully's gun stayed hidden. The squadron flew missions over Rabaul, Bougainville, and New Georgia. They bombed airfields and supply depots. They lost 2 more planes to belly attacks from Zeros. And every time Dutch Holloway climbed into cockpit, he thought about the hidden gun beneath his feet and wondered if Sully was a genius or a madman. Today, he got his answer. The Zeros regroup a mile behind the Iron Wolf, their formation tighter now, more cautious. There were 11 of them left, more than enough to bring down a lone bomber. The squadron leader rocked his wings, signaling the others. They split into 3 groups. 4 would attack from the front, drawing the nose gunners' fire. 4 would attack from the sides, occupying the waist gunners. And 3 would drop below again, gambling that the belly gun was a fluke, a lucky shot, not a real threat. They were wrong. Dutch saw the formation split on his tail. Here they come again. Sully, you've got 3 more climbing from below. Nose gunner, front group incoming. Waist gunners, watch your flanks. The bomber erupted in a symphony of machine gun fire. The nose turret hammered at the frontal assault. The waist guns chattered at the side attackers. And below, Sully swung his weapon toward the 3 Zeros, rising into the kill zone. This time, they were ready for him. They didn't climb in a straight line. They weaved and juked, zigzagging as they ascended, making themselves harder to hit. Sully didn't panic. He'd grown up hunting ducks in the Louisiana bayou. He knew how to lead a moving target. He aimed not at where the Zeros were, but where they were going to be. He fired a long burst. 3 seconds of sustained hell. The tracers arced downward, creating a curtain of lead. The first Zero tried to roll left and flew directly into the stream. The bullet shredded its right wing. The aileron tore off. The fighter flipped inverted and spun out of control. The second Zero pulled up hard, trying to climb above the fire. It worked for 2 seconds. Then the damaged fuel line and its engine caught fire. The cowling erupted in orange flames. The pilot bailed out, his parachute blossoming white against the blue. The third Zero turned in double way, abandoning the attack entirely. Up front, the nose gunner was screaming into the intercom. "I got one! I got one!" A Zero trailing smoke peeled away from the frontal assault, its engine coughing. The waist gunner scored hits on 2 more, forcing them to break off. And just like that, the swarm faltered. The remaining Zeros pulled back, circling at a distance. They'd started the fight with 15 aircraft. Now they were down to 6. And they still hadn't put the Iron Wolf out of the sky. The Japanese squadron leader looked at the American bomber, this single, battered B-24 that refused to die, and made a decision. He rocked his wings again, signaling withdrawal. The Zeros turned and flew east, back toward their base, leaving the Iron Wolf alone in the sky. Inside the bomber, the crew didn't cheer. They were too exhausted. Sully slumped against the bulkhead, his arms shaking from wrestling the heavy gun. His ears were ringing from the gunfire. His hands were blistered from the hot metal. Dutch's voice crackled over the intercom. Damage report. The responses came in one by one. The number 2 engine was overheating, but functional. The right wing had a dozen holes, but was holding pressure. The tail had taken a cannon shell through the rudder, but the control cables were intact. They were alive. They were flying. They were going home. When the Iron Wolf landed at Henderson Field 2 hours later, Captain Briggs was waiting on the tarmac with a clipboard and a face like a thunderstorm. He watched the crew climb out. He saw the bullet holes in the wings. He saw the smoke stains around the gun ports. And then he walked around to the belly of the plane. The false floor panel was gone, blown away during the fight. The opening was clearly visible, along with the crude welded mount and the .50 caliber gun still locked in position. Briggs stared at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Sully, who was standing at attention, waiting for the hammer to fall. "Sergeant Sullivan," Briggs said slowly, "you disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "You modified a military aircraft without authorization." "Yes, sir." "You endangered your crew with an untested weapon system." "Yes, sir." Briggs glanced at Dutch, then back at Sully. "How many did you get?" Sully blinked. "Sir." "How many Zeros did you shoot down with that thing?" "5 confirmed, sir. Maybe 6. Briggs nodded slowly. He looked at the gun again, then at the bullet holes in the bomber, then at the crew standing nearby, bruised, exhausted, but alive. Finally, he spoke. I want every B-24 in this squadron modified the same way by the end of the week. You'll supervise the installations personally, Sergeant. Dismiss. Sully just stared. Sir, you heard me. Now get to work before I change my mind. As Briggs walked away, Dutch came up beside Sully and clapped him on the shoulder. Congratulations. You just revolutionized bomber defense by being a stubborn son of a bitch. Sully grinned, still in shock. Does this mean I'm not getting court-martialed? Hell no. You're getting a medal. By the end of 1943, the Underbelly gun modification had spread to be 24 squadrons across the Pacific. The tactics saved hundreds of lives. The Japanese were forced to abandon their most effective attack strategy. Eventually, the factories caught up. The B-24J rolled off the assembly line with a proper Sperry ball turret, rendering the field modification obsolete. But the lesson remained. When the manual fails, improvise. When the enemy finds your weakness, turn it into a trap. And when someone tells you it can't be done, sometimes the best response is to grab a cutting torch and prove them wrong. Patrick Sullivan flew 35 combat missions and went home in 1945. He opened a machine shop in Louisiana and never talked much about the war. Dutch Holloway became a lieutenant colonel and trained bomber crews until Korea. The Iron Wolf was scrapped in 1946, melted down, and turned into refrigerators. But the story lived on. Reminder that sometimes the difference between victory and death is one man with a welder and the guts to break the rules.